Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City and on the internet at thestruggle.org. I was in Washington, D.C. recently and went to the famed bookstore Busboys and Poets to hear two Palestinians. They were Mira Dabit and Amer Shrurrab, and they told about their personal and family experiences in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Shrurrab talked about what happened to his father and brothers during Israel's winter attack, 2008-2009. On January 16th of 2009, they were driving in a car, saw Israeli soldiers who waved them on, but then filled their car with bullets. The three crawled out of the car and then lay in the street for 23 hours, while the father used his cell to call for an ambulance, to call relatives. He spoke live on Al Jazeera, all in vain. The two brothers died. I did interviews with Shrurrab and Dabit, and we'll present them to you today. Then up to 3,000 people rallied in New Haven, Connecticut, in front of the City Hall in a series of ever-growing protests against budget cuts and demands for sharp contract concessions. We'll hear from several of the speakers, including John Wilhelm, National President of Unite Here. Finally, another hard-hitting poem by Palestinian American Remi Kanazi, when he spoke in Connecticut at the Buttonwood. We begin in Washington, D.C., coincidentally on the day that the two Palestinians appeared at the Busboys and Poets. Justice Richard Goldstone, who is hated by the Israeli government for reporting to the UN on Israeli war crimes, had published an op-ed piece in the Washington Post retracting some of his charges.
I graduated from Middlebury College in Vermont in December 2008, and the year that followed I was practically a full-time activist, and then now I'm working at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C.
Yesterday at the Busboy and Poets, you told about the horrible story with your family, where your two brothers were killed and your father was with them 23 hours laying in the streets. What has happened since? Has there been investigations? What has been the result of this?
As far as we know, and as far as everyone we're involved with knows, there has been absolutely no investigation on part of the Israeli authorities. They have been asked to investigate by several human rights organizations, including Physicians for Human Rights and Beit Salem in Israel, by some Israeli journalists, including the famous columnist of Haaretz, Amira Haas. We asked them to investigate. Some Palestinian human rights organizations asked to investigate. Some European journalists, including a journalist from descibes, the famous German weekly, have asked if they have investigated or if they have an intention to carry any form of investigation. Congressman Billy Delahunt from Massachusetts has asked for an investigation. He contacted the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. to inquire about this specific case and asked for clarifications from the Israeli embassy, and he did not get any response. Also, Senator Pat Leahy from Vermont raised the story on the floor of the Senate, but so far the Israeli government has not investigated the case. They have not questioned anyone about any wrongdoing in this case and all the other cases, and up to date they refuse to bear any responsibility for the heinous crime.
Do they say anything? Do they respond in any way to letters or emails, all the requests you've made?
They don't provide a specific response. They say the IDF, the Israeli Defense Army, has a very strict code of conduct and doesn't, as a policy, doesn't target civilians. But as we learned from this story on a very personal level and so many other stories, the IDF or the Israeli army does intentionally target civilians, but they refuse to provide any specific response, where they say this is a matter of internal army policy and we may or may not conduct an investigation.
Now let me ask you about the Goldstone report, and Mr. Goldstone, who has put that rather surprising op-ed in the Washington Post. What was your reaction when you saw it?
Well, when I first read it, I was really infuriated because Mr. Justice Goldstone is trying to backtrack some of the results of his investigation, and he doesn't provide any substance or evidence for why he's retracting these findings. But the bottom line, Justice Goldstone did not say that Israel did not commit these crimes. He did not say hundreds of civilians were not murdered. He did not say over 300 children were not murdered. What he said in that piece is that we don't think Israel did it deliberately or as a matter of policy. We have strong reasons to believe that they did, but even if they didn't, they have killed 1,400 Palestinians. The overwhelming majority of them are civilians. They killed 320 children. They attacked UN schools and buildings, and they used white phosphorus to attack these UN buildings against civilians, which is prohibited by international law. And nevertheless, Israel and the Israeli government are rejoicing about that op-ed. Imagine if the U.S. government was guilty of killing 1,400 people, and then someone came to clear them and said, oh, they didn't do it as a matter of policy, but it was collateral damage. And then imagine what would happen if the American government rejoices about that statement that they killed 1,400 people, but the good thing it wasn't done deliberately. So the bottom line is Justice Goldstone still confirms that Israel did commit heinous murders and heinous crimes, and we have yet to see these people facing justice.
Thank you very much. Tell me a bit about your background.
Well, I am 25. My family comes from the city of Walid in the 48 territories, or what's called now Israel, and I live in Ramallah. And I'm a political activist, a student activist, and a folkloric storyteller.
And you were at what university?
Birzeit University.
In a couple minutes, it's really unfair, but in just a couple minutes, what are some of the problems people have getting to universities and pursuing an academic life?
Well, I can go back to the time where I was in university in 2003 to 2007, and our main obstacle was access to education through movement. So in the West Bank itself, there are about 500 and sometimes go up to 600 checkpoints. And basically, it's every almost 4 to 5 kilometers there's a checkpoint. And therefore, a lot of students going to universities could not access their universities, especially during the beginning of semesters. A lot of the checkpoints would be closed, or during exam time, and it sort of made it really hard to get to it.
What's the problem with a checkpoint? I assume it's a little more than showing a piece of paper and moving on.
Well, basically, there are different types of checkpoints. There's roadblocks. There's actually army outposts where you stop and you're being checked. There's other things like actual ditches in the ground, dug up roads that you have to access through walking and are often closed or are very difficult. For example, in my university in Birzeit, from about the year 2001 to about the year 2004, there was a checkpoint called the Surda checkpoint, and it was basically a ditch in the ground. This road usually connected Ramallah, a main city in the West Bank, to 38 villages surrounding it, and all of the access, all of the movement was blocked by this checkpoint because it connected students, teachers, workers, elderly, the disabled to the main city. And getting through that was not easy, because we also faced many harassment by the army. We faced humiliation. You were stopped very often. Sometimes they would close the checkpoint and you could not go through. You could not go to your home. You could not go to your university. And sometimes when we actually sort of objected against this, tried to go through, we were met with tear gas bombs and rubber bullets. So this is only the case of my university, but this flying checkpoint was removed in 2004 from in front of Birzeit, and we thought this is wonderful. We could pass. It was met with other forms of checkpoints, jeeps blocking the roads, and we still couldn't pass. We still couldn't access the movement to our education, even though people who live in Ramallah or people who lived in Jerusalem, getting to Birzeit took maximum 40 minutes to get there. But because of all of these blocks, we weren't able to get there as we wanted to, in 20 minutes.
How long would it sometimes take?
Well, for me personally, to leave, let's say I had class at 10 a.m., I would have to leave my home maximum at 7. Because you never knew how it was like. You never knew if it was open or closed. You never knew how much you were about to wait. So it was always, to get to your classes, you had to leave your home very early. And it affected a lot of other people's education through, let's say, some students from Jerusalem or some students from Hebron wanted to go to Birzeit, but the road was no longer open. It was no more accessible. They couldn't go there because it's too expensive for these poor students or people in poverty to rent an apartment, to live there, and to also pay for their education. So it really, it destroyed dreams. I mean, this blockade of movement destroyed dreams. And not only that, if we go back to 1987, education under the Israeli military occupation was made illegal. So
I remember that.
Yes, so nurseries were closed, primary and secondary schools were closed, universities were closed, and if you were an educator and attempted to educate your young people or your students, you were arrested. So there's always been a hostile attack on the education of the Palestinians. But despite this, the majority of the Palestinian people are educated beyond their bachelor's degree and are going to do their masters and their doctorates, because it's a part of our struggle and it's one of the most important bits of our fight.
One last question. Most of these checkpoints are not protecting Israelis. They're not between Palestine and Israel, but between one part of a Palestinian area and another. What is the explanation for that?
Well, I think if you want to keep a people oppressed and you want to keep them tired and you want to keep them sort of keeping their head down, you will make life difficult. You will say, if you don't do this, you won't be able to get to your home or to your work or to see your family or to your education. So people, especially after the second Intifada, after the second Palestinian uprising that happened in 2000, it was a popular uprising, it was a nonviolent uprising in the beginning. After that finished in 2000, and I would say 2005, 2006, things calmed down a little bit. People were tired. People were just saying, I want to work and I want to feed my family because I can't fight anymore. I'm exhausted. I've been fighting since I was born. My family has been fighting since they were born. So Israel is trying to make life difficult for the Palestinians. So also we would leave. They want us to go. They want us to leave our land. And I think this is a main theme of why things are so difficult. Because if they wanted to protect Israel, they would make the checkpoints or the apartheid wall that's being built inside the West Bank territories on the Green Line, on the border of 67. But no, they have built more and more illegal settlements in the Jerusalem area, in the West Bank, and they are building the apartheid wall that is basically there to take more agricultural land and more Palestinian land. So I don't know where security comes into it, because if you're treating people like this, if you're oppressing them, if you're making their life miserable, then they will fight back non-violently, mostly. This is what the Palestinians are doing. But if you are saying that you want peace, then why don't you just let the people live?
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
New Haven Public School student body. And our local government thinks that students can't articulate themselves on this economic climate. They don't even think we can say economic climate. So, we see that our teachers are being laid off. We see that our social workers are being laid off. We see that our janitors are being laid off. We see that workers in New Haven, private or public sector, are being laid off. We see pay cuts and we see financial abuse. Students are upset. The government, the local government expects students to become productive citizens in this area. They expect us to contribute to the wealth of New Haven, of the greater New Haven area. They expect us to contribute when we see the financial abuse that they've inflicted on all of you? I don't think so. We went into the mayor's office. We sat down with him and we told him that we are concerned, we are going to deal with this, and this isn't ending. We are going to negotiate. Don't cut students short. Before I even go on, I want all of you to know, all of you adults out here, don't cut us short. We know how to articulate ourselves. Don't talk about my diction. Don't talk about my extensive vocabulary. I know what I'm talking about. The students know what we're talking about. When you mess with the workers of the greater New Haven area, you mess with all of us.
My name is Betty Alford. I work at Truman School as a cook. I've been working as a cafeteria worker for 19 years. I love to feed the kids every day. I put a smile on their face for the kids. I love feeding the kids every day. They love the hot breakfast, hot lunch that I make every single day. You know why? Because a lot of those kids don't have a chance to eat at home. So, sisters and brothers, what the people in power are trying to do with our job will not only affect our work, but will affect our lives. The cafeteria workers, we are not greedy. We just looking to hold on to what we have.
Right. Our neighborhoods that are falling apart, we will help rebuild them by sticking together. My message to City Hall is that we only have one street shut. The next time we come out, we're shutting the city down. Our next speaker, someone his entire life, since he started here in New Haven many years ago in the 60s, his entire life across this country. Corporate America was not content with a lot of profit. They became overwhelmed by greed. They dragged down this great country and they brought us the Great Recession. And they came and they begged and they said, bail us out, bail us out. You have to bail us out. And so the taxpayers of America, because we care about our country, we bailed them out. Hundreds of billions of dollars, we bailed them out. Now you might think that they would be humble. You might think that they would be grateful. But they said, oh no, we're back. Greed is back, bigger and better than ever. We need jobs. And corporate America said, no, we're going to have less jobs. We're going to put more people out of work. We need health care. And they said, oh no, we're going to take away health care benefits or else make them so expensive that nobody can afford to pay for health care benefits. We need pensions so older people who've worked Christians. We need safe streets and safe communities. And they said, oh no, that costs too much. We're going to have more poverty, less jobs, more danger, and on top of that, we're going to lay off cops. And most of all, look at these glorious young people here. Most of all, we need education. Corporate America says, no, no, no. Education for all costs too much. Costs too much. Do they go to church? Do they pray? Do they sleep at night? How do we look these kids in the eye and say, we're going to vilify teachers, we're going to have private education for the rich, and everybody else is going to have to suck it up and skip generations of education. They're going to open Gateway down there, and there's going to be nobody in it to teach, and no kids who can afford to go there. But sisters and brothers, we're very, very lucky to be alive now in spite of all that. We're lucky to be alive because there's a new spirit in this world. There's a new spirit in this world. You can see it in Wisconsin. You can see it in Egypt. And you can see it right here. And that new spirit, thank God, is being led by our young people. It's the young people who took over the state capitol building in Wisconsin. It's the young people who turned down a 30-year dictatorship in Egypt. And so, we have great hope in our land, in spite of what corporate America is doing. And we say to them, it doesn't make any difference how old or how young you are, we are one. It doesn't make any difference whether you have a job, or you need a job, or you're disabled. We are one. It doesn't make any difference whether you have health care or whether you need health care. We are one. It doesn't make any difference how you choose to worship God. We are one. It doesn't make any difference how we choose to love one another. We are one. None of that makes any difference because the days of divide and conquer so corporate America can rule, those days are done.
Remi Kanazi is editor of the collection Poets for Palestine and author of Poetic Injustice.
I was having a conversation with a guy, and it was like a 2-hour conversation. We're talking about Israel-Palestine, and he sucked at life, and he's like, oh, and I was like, okay, whatever, but I'll still argue with you. But at the end of the conversation, he was like, you know, you're real reasonable. And I was like, oh, thank you. There's like racist tints in there. And he's like, you're real reasonable. And I was like, thanks. And he was like, well, are you Sunni or Shia? I was like, what? How is that relevant? And he's like, are you Sunni or Shia? And I was like, neither. I was like, I'm not religious. And then he's like, no, but what were you raised? And I was like, well, I was raised Greek Orthodox. And he's like, oh, I get it. And it was one of those like real like bigoted like supremacist like, oh, I get it. You're one of the reasonable ones. You're like the guy that like you're not so bad. You're one of the non-bad dark ones. And so I wrote this poem in response because I wanted to punch him in the face, but I'm also a proponent of nonviolent resistance, and I was like, oh, that won't work out well. So let me just write the poem. You're hanging. Let's talk. Bam. Okay. They say I'm one of the good ones. You can't tell by my skin color, but it's inherent in my breath. Heart soft, temper mellow, enlightened from fingertips to welcoming smile. And yet, I don't have enough ink, don't have enough minutes, years, or lifetimes to write down all their names, written in red on the wall, slaughtered, If I hear one more jackass ask my religion and think that one or the other would shape and define my worldview, I'm gonna flood his people, kill his firstborn, burn some witches, and have him drink at a separate water fountain, because I'm a real Christian, just like you. Turn perversion into pedagogy. This Zionist guy tells me my grandparents were just as oppressed as his grandparents by the Muslims in Palestine. Really? Last I checked, it was Jewish rifles held against temples that dispossessed Haifa and Jaffa, Ergun and Stern gang bombings that formed an ethnocentric state that didn't recognize Muslims or Christians as equals. Ayan Hirsi Ali wants to talk about dhimmis, but conveniently forgets Palestinian third-class status is the indigenous population. Not gonna have some hypocritical house rep tell me what's wrong with all those Muslims. Maybe I'll start listening to him. When he stops starving Jesus is poor, aborting black and Latino lives on death row, and overstepping homeless people on the way into his Whole Foods. And for the high and mighty liberal secularist, just because you don't call it a religion doesn't mean radical capitalism hasn't destroyed this country. With your grimy bankers and bailouts, liberals didn't mind destroying a country when they thought they could do it on the cheap and plant a Starbucks on every Iraqi street corner, then blame George Bush when shit hit the fan. Now, I don't know if this is a PSA or a poem, but I was raised Christian and still can't see how that matters. Hear Friday prayers walking to the subway in Brooklyn, visit every quarter in Jerusalem, never knew religion by name, but had faith in my people, know that xenophobia is in vogue and, well, I've never been that cool. But then again, maybe this all emanates from a religiously enlightened worldview that I'm predisposed to based on my Christian roots. Then again, maybe it's more simple. Maybe those who monolithically castigate 1.4 billion people are recalcitrant idiots, the true image of what they think the other is, the actual ultra evil that's created its own axis in which it fiendishly rules without knowing.
Next week, we'll replay part of a talk by Giuliano Amer Khamis that he gave at Yale University in 2007. Last week, Mir Khamis was murdered in Jenin in front of the Freedom Theater that he helped found. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.